Good morning. We are going to give it just maybe 30 seconds to a minute just to get a few more people in. So grab a coffee, get settled, and then we'll get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So good morning, and thank you all for joining us today for the Human Trafficking in Indiana, Addressing Barriers to Access for Youth Survivors webinar, hosted by HCET with presenters Haleigh Rigger and Morgan Rumple-Whiting. So my name is Bailey Schroeder. I am a training manager here at HCET, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Let me first briefly introduce you to healthcare education and training. HCET's mission is to provide comprehensive program development, education, and training to improve reproductive and sexual health outcomes. HCET is an organization of passionate people who are proactive in their belief that access to evidence-based, medically accurate reproductive and sexual health education, training, and care is a fundamental right. For more information and to keep up to date with HCET events, please be sure to follow HCET on these various social media platforms and visit our website at hcet.org. For additional training and professional development opportunities, visit our virtual learning website at learn.hcet.org. Now I will quickly review a few housekeeping items. A link to complete an evaluation will be sent to you after this webinar via your email. There will also be a QR code at the end that you can scan if you'd like to do it right away. Archived presentations and a list of upcoming events can be viewed on our website. If you have any technical difficulties during this presentation, please contact me at the email listed on your screen. The presenters for today's webinar do not have any actual, potential, or perceived conflicts of interest to disclose. To enable subtitles today, you can click the live transcript icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can then click Show Subtitles and then change the settings if needed. Throughout the presentation, we encourage you to send your questions via the chat box. To submit a question, you can hover over the main screen and then select the chat icon. Once you select the chat icon, a chat box should appear on the right side of your screen. To send a question at any time during the presentation, please send it to either all hosts or all participants. This just ensures that everyone behind the scenes can view your question. All right, now I would like to introduce you to your presenters for today. So Haleigh Rigger is an organizer and activist with a passion for creating safer communities through connection, mutual aid, and accessibility. As a nonprofit consultant specializing in capacity building and program design, Haleigh brings over a decade of experience in mental health and disability justice, housing access, and anti-violence. Haleigh holds a bachelor's degree in public affairs from Indiana University, where she is now pursuing a master's of social work with a focus on community and organizational leadership. Let me make sure we're adding everybody in here. All right, so your second presenter is Morgan Rumple-Whiting. She is a Black queer woman and survivor of sexual and interpersonal violence who lives in Louisville, Kentucky. She completed her bachelor's degree in international studies with a minor in gender studies from Hanover College in Hanover, Indiana. Today, Morgan works for ICF in its Human Trafficking Collective. She truly enjoys supporting agencies across the United States that receive federal funding from the Office for Victims of Crime for Human Trafficking Victim Services and ensuring they have the support to provide the best response to survivors. So without further ado, I will be turning things over to Haleigh and Morgan.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bailey. Haleigh is going to share her screen, you all. So just give us 1 second to do that transition. We will get started. There we go. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for taking time out of what I perceive to be very busy days to join us for this really important conversation. As Bailey said, we're going to be talking about human trafficking and kind of the landscape of what it looks like to have barriers, but also even success in the field with working with youth survivors throughout Indiana. Also just want to flag for folks who may not be familiar, but I'm sure a lot of folks are, that it is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So you may have been getting a lot of being bombarded with information this month around human trafficking, but just want to highlight that this is a time that the field really kind of pushes information out and just wants to ensure that we have some collective learning across many sectors on what this looks like and how you can have impact and make change in your own community. So again, thank you all so much for being here. Bailey really did great introductions in terms of just my role and what I do. I came from doing direct service, and then over the last 6 years transitioned to doing and providing more training and technical assistance to those who provide on the ground support to survivors of human trafficking, interpersonal violence, or sexual violence. And now, as Bailey said, I work for the OVC, Office for Victims of Crime, Human Trafficking Collective. And what we do is we support anyone who receives federal funding from OVC for victim services throughout the United States. So if anyone is a part of that, you may see more of me, but if not, that's really what I do full time. And then on the side, I also have my own organization called Access to Freedom, where we really work to address the underlying causes to violence and look to find innovative new ways of addressing violence that isn't kind of rooted in, I would say, punitive or carceral response. So that's me. I'll hand it over to Haleigh to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I am Haleigh Rigger. I use she, her pronouns. Yeah, like Morgan said, Bailey did a great job. Just a little bit of background about me. Currently, I'm a consultant with Indiana Youth Institute. So if you are interested in today's work and you'd be interested in working with me further, you can reach out to Indiana Youth Institute. They have some great grants available as well for nonprofits who maybe don't have consulting in their budget. So check that out. I'm a co-leader with Indiana Disability Justice. We are a group of disabled folks and disabled allies working together to prevent and end violence against people with disabilities. You can also check out our work at indisabilityjustice.org if that is something that interests you as well. Like Bailey already mentioned, I have a background in a variety of things, but primarily direct service. Before I came to macro level work, I was doing crisis intervention and housing case management. I worked with a lot of people who had experienced violence. Spoiler alert, it's a major cause of trauma, and that's a major cause of crisis, right? So that's kind of what brought me to violence prevention and sharing with you all some of the things that we've learned as we have worked with survivors. I've been doing some program design and capacity building over the last few years as well, which is a really fun way for me to engage in this work in a different way. So I cannot see the chat right now, but I'm going to ask you all to share a little bit about you. Morgan can read some stuff out. We want to know who's in the room. So if you could share your name, your organization, and maybe one thing you hope to get out of our session today. And I'll take just a moment to let y'all enter that in if you're interested in sharing.
It always takes me a minute to write things, so I feel.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Well, as we wait, I can just go ahead and talk about our agenda for the day. You probably already saw this when you registered, but I just want to give you a little reminder about what we're working on. So primarily, we're going to start out talking about what exactly is human trafficking. Some of you may already have a really solid understanding of this. Some of you may be learning this for the first time. So we just want to make sure that we have a shared definition of what that means. We're also going to identify risk and protective factors and just kind of talk about what human trafficking might actually look like in the folks that we're serving. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the connection between systemic oppression, human trafficking, and the barriers to accessibility. When we get to the risk and protective factors, you'll understand why that's so crucial. But for Morgan and I, it's really important that we talk about the true roots of violence if we're going to talk about ways to prevent and intervene and best support survivors. So we will be spending a lot of time in that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some ways that you can frame policies and procedures in your organization for exploring trauma-informed responses, for developing trauma-informed policies, both for how you can best support survivors and also how you can support one another in this work. I see that we have some stuff in the chat now.
We do. We have Shelly who said, who's from Randolph County, looking to see the scope and really understanding more about how human trafficking impacts particularly rural Indiana, which Shelly, you lucked out. Haleigh and I are both from rural Indiana, so we got some insight into that for sure. Also just looking at how to best support youth who have experienced trafficking, looking at what trauma associated with human trafficking, how to recognize it. Let's see, how to practice supporting people ethically, especially people under the age of 18, rates in immediate communities and rural areas. What can we do to support? How can we combat these issues? Signs to look for, supporting runaway youth, increasing knowledge and trauma-informed practices.
Okay, so we got quite the broad range, but it sounds like most folks are here for the same reasons. So yay, you made it. We're here together. All right. So whenever we do a training, we just like to set some ground rules or community agreements for how we're going to work together. We're going to be together for about 2 hours today, so that's a lot of time. And we just want to make sure we're doing that ethically, as somebody else just mentioned, and that we are respecting one another. And creating really an emergent space where we can talk about some of this really heavy stuff that we're going to be dealing with. So some of these guidelines I have borrowed from my friends and colleagues at Indiana Disability Justice. The first one is step up to speak and step up to listen. Now, we're on Zoom today, so that might be a little different than it would be in person. But what this really means is for those of you who are kind of the wallflowers, the quiet ones, we really want to ask you to step into a engaging space. Share with us what you're thinking about. Share with us questions you have, how this is impacting you, what this is making you think of, that kind of thing. Those of you who talk a lot, myself, we are invited to step into a listening space. That's going to be easy since we're on Zoom. It's a lot easier to sit back and listen. But we really do want to hear from y'all. So please share your questions or thoughts in the chat. We will answer questions, kind of either as they come up or towards the end if we're seeing a lot and we just kind of want to focus on getting through, and we can kind of circle back to some of those questions. But there will be some times where we ask you to engage. So thank you so far for doing that with us. Number 2, there is always time for the right work. I think this is going to be reflected a lot in our presentation today. It is important that we really stop and address harm as it happens. It is important that we talk about social justice in order to frame the interventions that we're doing and the prevention strategies that we have. So that's one thing we like to highlight. There's always time for the right work. And we hope that you might consider how to implement that in your own organization or in your work in the community as well. What that really means is that if there's something that happens, if we say something that is hurtful to you or vice versa, we're gonna address that. We're gonna deal with that as it comes up. Number 3, people make mistakes. Mistakes are not people. So we want to establish that in how we work with one another. But this is, again, going to be reflected in how we work with youth survivors. It's going to be reflected in how we work with people in community. And it's going to be reflected in a lot of pieces of this presentation today. So if Morgan and I, or Morgan or I misstep, or if one of you say something kind of weird in the chat, we're going to make the assumption that that was a mistake and that that is not a bad person. We're going to move at the speed of trust. So that means, and I'm sure y'all are working with youth survivors or youth generally, you know that you can't move any faster than it takes to develop that rapport and that trusting relationship. So we're doing the same here. If you don't believe in us, if you don't believe what we're having to say here, if you don't have trust that we know what we're talking about, we're not going to get very far. So we're going to move at the speed of trust and try to kind of establish a trustworthy space here first. And then lastly, I really like the oops, ouch rule. It kind of helps us do number 2. Oops, ouch means that we address harm as it comes up. So if I am harmed, I say ouch. I talk about it with the person that has caused harm. They say oops, and we can move forward. All right, I'm going to pass back to Morgan so that we can actually get into it.
Awesome. Thank you, Haleigh. So as Haleigh mentioned earlier, we know that folks coming into the room all have various different foundational knowledge on what human trafficking is, what it looks like, and what you're wanting to get out of the session today. So I appreciate you all sharing that earlier. So I want to start by just asking folks to put in the chat, when you hear the words human trafficking, what do you think of? Is there a definition that comes to mind? Is there a phrase or a word that comes to mind? Is there a movie or a TV show? What is human trafficking, and what is your knowledge of what human trafficking is? We will give you all a second to put some of your responses in the chat, and Haleigh will help me in sharing those out. So what is human trafficking? I know some folks have probably seen some movies or some shows. I feel like over the last couple of weeks, somehow, my partner and I have watched movies that we thought were about something. And at the end of it, I was like, oh, so this was actually about human trafficking. And then you're sitting there like, you know, when you do the work all day, you weren't trying to watch a movie maybe, but I've noticed it more and more in the media. So I don't know if folks have also noticed that too.
Yeah, this came up yesterday for me in a conversation. Okay, we've got a couple of people in here. Human trafficking is the exploitation of a human being, either through labor or sex by means of force, threat, or coercion.
Okay.
Exploitation of vulnerable populations through labor, sex, etc. Someone says, makes me think of a child being taken, bought, and sold. Someone is being really honest and referring to what Morgan just mentioned in the media. Someone said, I used to often think of the movie Taken with Liam Neeson.
Yes, yes.
Someone who's forced to do something they did not choose to do on their own, possibly by coercion, threats, or violence. Controlling and manipulating groups of people. Last one in here is, I think of it as broad as global taking of people for forced labor, sex, or other stuff. And as close as my neighbor girl who was trafficked by local males for drugs and money. Sexually, physically, mental abuse, force, threat, being sold and held against will.
Wow, wow. That's awesome, y'all. A lot of great insight. And I particularly really noticed some of the language that many of you used in terms of referring to what it is, that it kind of going beyond even just being taken, but thinking about things like manipulation, thinking about things about how it impacts your mental health. And so just really broad understanding throughout the room, which I think is going to lead to some really great conversation today. So thank you all for sharing that. I wanted to ask a second question before we moved into the definitions and what this looks like, but separate question, what causes human trafficking? What causes human trafficking? And some of you already kind of touched on this a little bit, but when you actually think of what can lead to someone maybe experiencing this exploitation, what is it? What causes it? We'll give you a second to put some of your responses in the chat.
As we're waiting, I just want to say again, thank you all so much. You're already jumping in and engaging with us, and it makes our job so much easier and so much more fun for everyone. So thank you.
Yeah, we don't just like to listen to ourselves all day. So thank you all for your insight. So what are some of the causes of human trafficking?
Okay, somebody says greed and selfishness. Ooh,
Okay.
that's interesting.
Yeah, I could really dive into that. What else?
Wow, tough question. Power, greed, and evil.
Okay.
Vulnerability, someone says.
Okay.
On the survivor's end, often it has to do with a lack of resources creating a vulnerability, i.e. lack of housing, community, food, acceptance, or access.
Mm.
Home life that causes youth to run, escaping difficult living situations. Evil, power. The expectation of the exploited of someone providing a better way of life or fulfilling a need for them.
Well, y'all, I feel like we're gonna have a really great conversation today. Y'all came for it, so we're gonna do it. Thank you for that feedback. We are really going to touch on all of this today. All of your answers are correct, and I feel like Haleigh and I, we talk often. We could talk to y'all about this stuff all day, but for time's sake, we can't. But we are definitely going to touch on all of this. So thank you all for this, for the insight that you shared so far. We're going to do just a quick definitions check. Again, just to lay some of that foundational knowledge and make sure we're all on kind of the same page as we move through the rest of the presentation today. So I'm going to share with you a resource that many of you may have already seen. You can go to the next slide, Haleigh, thank you. It's called the AMP model, the Action, Means, and Purpose model. So this model was actually developed by the federal government as a way of explaining what human trafficking is. When we were doing these trainings years and years ago, how we really approached it at the time was kind of just like, here's the actual federal or state definition of what human trafficking is, which is good, especially for people who are super legal nerds and like love to look into that, like that perspective. But we were really missing people and losing people at that kind of in-depth definition. So the federal government said, okay, well, let's come up with a new tool that folks can use to better understand what human trafficking looks like. So this model was developed, and I'm just going to briefly walk through some of the pieces of this. I won't go into depth on every single part of it, but just to give you all some insight into kind of what we're talking about today when we talk about what human trafficking is. So let's start with the action. I heard many of you mention kind of that actual process of taking someone and actually selling someone to someone else, which is traditionally and 100% how we have really developed our knowledge of what human trafficking is. And like I said, that is the actual selling of someone else, forcing or taking, kidnapping, which can definitely happen and be a part of the trafficking process. However, we found it really important, and the federal government found it really important to say, we want to make sure folks understand that there are different parts of human trafficking that someone can be involved in. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're selling someone to someone else, but they're actually participating in that process. So, for example, recruitment. Recruitment is, for me, kind of tricky. And Haleigh and I, one of the reasons we ask about like the causes of human trafficking and things like that is because we like to, again, look at what some of the root causes to violence is or are. And so when I talk about recruitment, it can be kind of tricky because what we find often in someone who is considered a recruiter is that not always, but many times, often, the person who's actually fulfilling a recruitment role for a trafficker has been someone who's been a victim of theirs for a long time, or for a time. They're a victim themselves. And often they may be recruiting other people as a means of survival, or even, and we're going to talk about why some folks are vulnerable to human trafficking later. But maybe it's because this person that they're with, especially when we're talking about youth. I don't know how many times I've heard kids that when I look at a situation and I'm like, okay, there's definitely trafficking going on here. But you have a kiddo that's looking at you and saying, but this is, for me, this is love. I love this person. This is my family. I'm putting food on the table for my family. And so often, again, this person may be participating in the recruitment process, but they're victims themselves and often are in these situations for various different reasons that we're going to look at later. So all that to be said, even though it's a tricky piece, it's still important to kind of understand that if you're participating in that recruitment process, you can still experience being charged or facing response as you are a trafficker yourself. So I just like to kind of explain that because it can be difficult when I explain recruitment. I don't like to, it's hard because we're talking about people who are victims themselves. You may even have people who are actually holding individuals in a location. So for example, we may see this a lot of times with labor trafficking, particularly cases I've seen have been with restaurants where you have people who work, live, eat everything in this restaurant, also work in this restaurant, and are being held there. So you may have individuals who are doing that, and is again possibly considered, but not possibly, is considered trafficking these individuals who are being held against their will. And then the last one I would say is like transporting, if I can say that word and get it out of my mouth. Transportation. So you may see situations, this happens, there's one in particular that I talk about that happened probably about 7-8 years ago now. A big story came out in Texas where you had an individual, a semi driver, who was pulled over and they found a number of individuals in the back of his semi. Unfortunately, at that time, there were a couple of people who had been deceased. There were a number of people who were still currently alive, but they were all being transported for the purpose of being trafficked. And even though the individual who was driving the semi was like, "Oh no, I didn't know that they were back there," even though he said that, he was still charged with trafficking because he was transporting for that purpose. So, I also like to note that semi driver is from Louisville. So again, kind of closer to home than some might want to think, but the actual transportation piece is important, and you can also be considered part of the trafficking process and be charged, even if you aren't physically selling an individual to another person. So those are some different actions that you can possibly be involved in, which again, I think it's just important to think about. And I think we're really big at like wanting to open our eyes and just thinking about other ways that someone can be involved in the actual process. And I think a couple of people mentioned force, fraud, and coercion, which is awesome. That means that y'all are just on top of it. So force, fraud, and coercion, I would say, are 3 words that have become very much tied to trafficking, and typically whenever I think of trafficking, those words immediately come to mind because I feel like we were taught those from the beginning, right? Force, fraud, and coercion, force, fraud, and coercion. So these 3 elements must be present in order to say, particularly when we're talking about charging someone, to be able to say that this person is a trafficker. So, or maybe that this person has experienced human trafficking. So the force, I think, as many of you already kind of picked up on, this can look various different ways. Often we think about actually forcing someone. I always think about taken, as someone had brought up, but actually forcing someone, taking someone and forcing them into to human trafficking. So that can be part of it. What we see, and kind of what I want to touch on in terms of Indiana, force is definitely one that we see a lot of in various different ways, and it's happening in almost every single situation that there is. We also see a lot of fraud. These situations can happen in both sex and labor trafficking. For example, speak primarily to labor trafficking, where we might see situations where someone can be brought in and told, if you come work for me, I'll pay you, this amount of money to come work for me. And then they get here, or they get to the location where they're going to work, and the person says, just kidding. Since I actually brought you here, now you actually owe me money because I transported you. I paid for you a place to live. I'm feeding you, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have someone who's in debt bondage, but they didn't come on the premise that this was all going to occur to them. So that fraud piece, we see often in many cases, both labor and sex, but I often see it in a lot of labor trafficking cases. And then coercion being the last piece, I would arguably say is one of the most common, if not happening again in almost every case that we might work on in various different ways. However, coercion can be sometimes the hardest to prove, and that can be for many different reasons. But, for example, a coercion tactic can be, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to harm someone in your life. I'm going to do something to your home. I'm going to hurt one of your pets. I'm going to ruin your career. I'm going to share these pictures all across the school, which is something we see a lot with youth cases. So that coercion tactic we know is happening. That's a big reason why a lot of individuals may not feel safe enough to leave the situations that they're in. However, those are often hard to prove because they're conversations that may be happening in person, are not things that someone may be willing to admit was said to them, or a trafficker may not be willing to admit they use that type of threat. But we know that those conversations are happening, and we know those situations are happening. I will say, for folks who maybe follow cases, there was a case out of Ohio a couple of years. Oh, I say that, but it's probably been about 6 or 7 years now. And in that case, they actually went to court and focused heavily on the coercion tactic. And what they found is that the trafficker was actually getting victims addicted to drugs in order to better control or traffic them. And they actually won that case. We had them come down to Indiana at some point and speak about it, because we were like, how did you go into a courtroom and was able to convince jury and all these folks that this was a coercion tactic used to traffic an individual? But they did it. And so we do see some success. However, it can be difficult, again, just to prove that coercion tactic. And then lastly, as many of you already picked up on and mentioned, for the purposes of sex, commercial sex, that can include things like stripping, dancing, things like that. So not just sex itself necessarily. And then also for things like for labor and services, for labor trafficking. I'm going to talk more on the next slide about the fact that minors who experience commercial sex are human trafficking victims, and you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for anyone under the age of 18. For anyone over the age of 18 in cases, you do have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. I'll break down on the next slide what that actually kind of means and looks like, because it can be a little confusing. So that being said, just a couple of things in Indiana specifically to know. Number one, anyone can be a victim, a trafficker, or a buyer. And you're probably like, Morgan, duh, why do you need to say that anyone can be a victim, trafficker, or buyer? The reason that I think it's important just to address it is because we have made mistakes in this field. As Haleigh said, we make mistakes. That doesn't mean we're bad people. We have to learn from them and improve as we move forward. And early on in this movement, we did a lot of, I would say, awareness to bring awareness to human trafficking that actually did a lot of harm. For example, when I would go to trainings, I would say, when you think of who a victim is, who do you think of? And often people would think of young white girls. I would ask the same question about a trafficker, and often people would say Black men. And then I would say the same about a buyer, and people would often say older white men. when people would think about who those individuals were, that's who came to mind. That had a lot to do with the way that we were showing or demonstrating what human trafficking was, pictures that we would use, things that we would include in our trainings. And honestly, it did a lot of harm. It meant that we were not seeing everybody that needed our services. It meant that people who were getting convicted were not always the ones who were actually causing harm, or they were causing harm, but we were only locking up specific people who looked a certain way. We were only going into certain communities to look for human trafficking. And the reality is, and we're going to look at this later, in terms of Indiana, a lot of what I just said of the people that we assume in these roles are not true. And so we did do harm that way. So it is important just to recognize that anyone can be be in one of these positions. There is restitution available for victims who experience human trafficking to get reimbursed for the time that they experienced their crime and the exploitation that they experienced. A lot of folks, I don't know if anyone in this room has had experience with restitution and working to get restitution for survivors. There's been success and challenges, but I think it's important for folks to know that if you're working with someone, that you know that this is a possibility, especially if you're an advocate and you're working with them alongside the criminal justice system, supporting them through, you can get restitution back for some of the experiences that you've had. Knowing the human trafficking victim rights for youth, really just, I think y'all are in this room, you're advocates, knowing the rights of the people that you work with is critical. And then equipping them with knowing what their rights are is just even more important. So just knowing what some of the rights are for youth survivors in Indiana, particularly survivors who experienced human trafficking or experienced other forms of violence, can be important as you move forward. Sure, you all are familiar that there is a new CHINS designation. I say new, it's been here for a minute, but just awesome that we were finally able to get here. I remember when this happened. I remember in 2016 when we finally got that CHINS designation to say that human trafficking is something that our youth and children are experiencing. And so now when you call DCS, you can say, I believe someone is experiencing human trafficking, and that will should get a specific response, a time that someone needs to report to that family, and then what does the follow-up look like for that individual can look different if they're experiencing human trafficking. So when Indiana, that we got there. Now, are there kinks in it? Yes, absolutely. Still working it out as anything within our systems. We always have to work things out, but we have it. So we'll talk about reporting later. And then that last piece, like I said in the last slide, I just wanted to touch on the fact that federally and in the state of Indiana, there is no such thing as a child prostitute. So often you will hear people refer to, 14-year-old who may be engaging in commercial sex, but doesn't have someone who's actually physically selling them themselves. We see this a lot when we see youth who are trying to find a place to live, trying to get some food, trying to survive. And that doesn't, even if that is occurring, that does not mean that that child is a prostitute. That means that that child still falls under the category of human trafficking. And that person, the person who is considered the trafficker are the people who are actually purchasing or paying that child for their services. So we just like to highlight that because, again, language matters. And when we're working with youth, we want to make sure that we're not putting them in some type of victim blaming where victim blaming shouldn't even occur. So we'll just want to kind of point that out. Again, that's a federal and Indiana based law. And then lastly, I think for me, I don't know how many folks are familiar with this tool. If you've done any work in domestic violence, in the domestic violence field, you may have seen this power and control wheel in terms of domestic violence, but a couple of years ago, this was adapted to fit human trafficking as well. I really love this tool back when I was doing direct service. And I think when you're working with youth or older youth and you're wanting to look at breaking down, okay, what is it that you may be experiencing? I used to use this tool with survivors of domestic violence that I was working with, the DV one. And we used to sit down and say, okay, maybe in terms of what brought you and led you into coming to seek services from me, maybe it was related to physical abuse. However, I want to talk to you more about some of the other things that you may be experiencing throughout what's been occurring, because that's not the only experience of domestic violence. Just like maybe being sold for sex is not the only thing that a victim of human trafficking is experiencing. And so this is a really good tool for both you all as you're looking and wanting to kind of think through some of these pieces. And then if you're working with individuals and you want to maybe have discussion on what it really looks like or some of the things that they're experiencing. And it doesn't necessarily, you don't have to label when you sit down with someone, okay, I'm trying to think of, say that you're experiencing trafficking. You don't have to look at that. You can even block those words out around the circle. But if you just want to say, okay, what type of intimidation may you be experiencing? Isolation, what do all these look like? And collectively, what are things that we can do as someone who's your support person to address some of these issues? So anyway, it's a great tool. Definitely would encourage you all to check it out and use it as you see fit. And now I will hand it over to Haleigh to talk about some risk and protective factors.
Thank you, Morgan. So that was a really great grounding for what we're going to talk about next. So we're going to kind of look at the various levels of risk and protective factors. We're going to kind of tag team this. I'm going to come in with the bad news. Morgan's going to sweep in with some good stuff. So if we know there are risk factors, that means we also know that there are protective factors. There are ways that we can combat those risk factors and prevent violence. So we like to use the socio-ecological model, which is typically utilized by public health professionals. So it is a public health approach to violence prevention and intervention. You probably maybe even have seen this model in relation to disease prevention, COVID-19 prevention. So this solution, or this model is solution focused, which is great. It also means it's really heavily evidence-based, but also heavily led by people with power and degrees. So it is an incredible roadmap for thinking about prevention and intervention and how all of these factors kind of work together and compound upon one another. But you're going to hear it from us several times for this. It is crucial that we integrate social justice principles into this model so that we're not just recreating the same systems of oppression that created the vulnerabilities in the first place. So our solutions and our prevention and our interventions have to transform that harm meaningfully to make sure that we're not just putting someone back in the same situation or a similar situation that they were in to begin with. So I really like to utilize disability justice principles when I'm thinking about the socio-ecological model, centering approaches that integrate our interdependence, acknowledge how we all are connected, how our individual, interpersonal, community, and societal factors are all interconnected, how we are responsible for one another as community, and how if we're centering collective liberation, if we're working together, that's how we're going to get that really meaningful transformation, right? So I just like to use this as well. You can see that these are kind of overlapping circles, and at the center in the middle here, we've got the individual. So that's the primary, or like the most individual level risk factors and protective factors. And that's usually the crisis intervention stuff that we're doing, or that's like safety that we're doing with kids. Interpersonal is that relationship area. So our friends, our family, our close networks. Community is our geographic as well as social community. So the neighborhoods we live in, the people we interact with, our church community, our school community, my knitting circle, whatever it is that is your community. And then the societal level is going to be the bigger, broader factors. So things like our laws and policies, things like the isms. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. Social factors are things that like have created long-term vulnerabilities that trickle down through the community, interpersonal and individual levels. So we're going to start here with individual risk factors. And one thing I really want to talk about is somebody mentioned in the chat earlier, individual vulnerabilities are tied to a lack of something. And I really want to talk about that. What does it mean for us if the vulnerability is caused by a lack of? Does that mean that the person is responsible? Or does that mean that a societal and structural cause is at play, right? So whenever I talk about individual risk factors, I really need to hammer in that individuals are not inherently vulnerable because of who they are. They are vulnerable because of social and structural factors that have marginalized them and normalized violence towards them. I am not at risk of violence because of my disability status, because of my gender, because of my sexuality, right? I am maybe at higher risk of experiencing violence because of the normalization of violence towards women, or the normalization of violence towards people with disabilities, or people who are bisexual, or kind of understand that. So I am going to talk about these, but I just wanted to kind of put that out there. We are not saying that kids are inherently vulnerable because of their age. What I am going to say is that, why would you think age might be a risk factor for human trafficking? And if anybody has thoughts, please go ahead and share it in the chat. I'm going to talk about some other things too, but I just want to hear what you all think. Why would age or youth be a risk factor for experiencing human trafficking? Engaging in commercial sex is going to be a risk factor. And why might that be? Well, like somebody already said, there's a lack of something there, right? We've got to meet some basic needs. So this might be some survival sex that a youth is engaging in to meet their needs. Maybe they don't feel they have ownership of their own body. They haven't been told that they have ownership over their own body. They haven't been given language to talk about their body, to talk about sexuality, to talk about relationships and what is acceptable or unacceptable. Maybe they haven't seen healthy relationships in their lives. Maybe that's not been demonstrated for them. Yes, thank you, Shelley. Youth are at risk because they need to depend on adults for care. So they need someone who kind of knows what's going on to provide some supports for them. But I also want to think about, what rights do youth have in our society? None, right? Like kids just don't have rights, basically.
Very little.
We have determined that you have to be the age of 18 to be an adult, which for very good reasons, right? We got to protect kids. But that also means that kids don't have a lot of choice or right to make decisions for themselves. So they are dependent on adults who may make decisions for them. And I'm going to talk about this a little more in the community risk factors, but just kind of think about that. Adults are making decisions for them. Kids don't have a lot of rights. They do have to rely on someone to help them make the choices that they need to make to get their needs met. Again, because they may not have been given language about relationships or sexuality, because they may not have been given access to or been able to see what healthy relationships look like. Violence might be normalized for them. And this history of systems involvement, again, this might be related to a normalization of violence. Like Morgan said this earlier about relationships. If I have always been treated poorly by the adults in my life, I'm going to assume that that is how relationships are. And I'm just going to assume that this person who's being mean to me and is violent to me, that's okay, that there's nothing wrong with how they're treating me, but at least they're going to give me a bed to sleep in and some food to eat tonight. So again, this is a culmination of individual risk factors, but they're really, really rooted in that societal level risk factor. I guess that's the spoiler alert, right? I'm going to pass to Morgan to talk about how we can kind of combat some of these risk factors.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to Haleigh's point, like with the protective factors too, these are important, very much rooted in how do we as a society wrap around these individuals and change some of the actual systemic outcomes for folks and create protective factors. So I did want to pause and just say, as you can tell, Haleigh and I are taking a little bit of a different approach in terms of how we explain what vulnerability is. If you've taken trainings before in human trafficking, you may have noticed that there's been focus on things we refer to as indicators or red flags. But the reason, and I wanted to kind of say this before going to protective factors, the reason we take this approach is because, again, we find it really often what we look for in this field are what are things that survivors are needing to do so that they are changing the situations that they're in, where in reality, that's a part of it, but they can't do that unless they have the societal support to be able to do those things. So that, all that being said, when it comes to individual protective factors, for example, sense of bodily autonomy, we have very much taught youth and children, not necessarily us in this room, but overall, like some of the feedback that you might get when you watch TV or you watch movies, or even in conversations, or how adults talk to, that we don't, there's no ownership over your body. You know, you do what I say, I'm your parent, this is what your doctor said you have to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's definitely some reasons that some of that is in place. But at the end of the day, a lot of youth who may be experiencing violence towards their body often may say, and I've heard kids tell me this, that it's just a body. It's not like it's not mine. Like I don't even, it's not even my body. And so this is a really big thing that we have to really overcome as a society. But when we're working with these youth survivors, to say, wait a minute, you've experienced a lot of trauma to your body. How do we address that trauma so that you feel safe to make your body yours? And how do you advocate for yourself, your whole self? That includes your body as well. And so as folks who educate and train and support individuals who do this work, we think it foundationally is really important that we are talking to kids and we are talking to youth about rights of body, what bodies are, having open conversations. I think when I've done some of this work, I feel like folks are like, we don't want to get kids too exposed too early, but there are definitely different ways to do it. And we have found that when you have kind of that sense of bodily autonomy at a younger age, it can impact and build a protective factor around you in terms of what exploitation could possibly look like in the future, and even ways as providers, how you're going to support the individual through their healing process. So that sense of bodily autonomy can be really important. We're big advocates for it. Allowed to be who they are. I think someone mentioned in the chat earlier that being able to be yourself is so important. I was like, oh my gosh, we're going to talk about that later. It's like y'all are reading our minds. So being allowed to be who they are. One of the largest populations of individuals that we see who experience violence, but also particularly who are experiencing this type of exploitation, sexual violence, are members of our LGBTQ plus queer communities, especially in terms of our youth populations. Why? Well, often a lot of these kiddos who are ending up on the streets, who are ending up without homes, food, shelter, support, are because they weren't allowed to be who they were in their own homes, and they had to leave for their own survival. And so we really do truly feel that when you have those supportive spaces, not just within your home, but it has to be a community effort, it has to be a societal effort, it has to be in your church, it has to be in your schools, everywhere. Being allowed to be who you are is going to be an essential piece to being able to curve the trajectory for so many of these youth, to reduce the vulnerability to violence in the future. At least one positive adult in their life, I think this has been something we've talked about in youth work for so long, being that one positive adult. But back to what Haleigh was saying is when you've had adults in your life who you go to as the people of your protectors, as your teachers, as your caregivers, as the people who are supposed to love you, and they have taught you what all of this is, but not in a healthy way, then that's what you see. That's how you project the world many times. And so we have seen, and a lot of kids have even said, I remember that one person. I work with a survivor who tells a really great story around this, who's like, I remember that one person who told me it did not have to be like this, that I did not have to feel this way, that love did not have to look like this and feel this way. And that was the first person. I was 25 years old, and that was the first person who ever told me that. So for us, when we're thinking about youth and we're thinking about just interventions that we may not even recognize sometimes, but just knowing that being that one person to say to someone, you don't have to, or this is what it could look like. This is what love could look like. And we don't just talk about this with providers. We also talk about this with people who are systems workers. I tell police officers this. I tell anyone who may engage a youth that you may be the first one. Don't wait on someone else to be the first one. And then can I identify safe and unsafe situations? Again, this is looking as if it's kind of placing the responsibility on a survivor or a youth individual. And it does in some sense, but again, the responsibility is actually on the community and on society and creating both the awareness of what safe and unsafe looks like, but also being able to provide accessible resources that if someone is experiencing an unsafe situation, that they can actually access safety. And unfortunately, for so many of the communities that we work with, underserved, marginalized communities, that's just not something that is available. I can't access justice the same way someone else can. I can't access resources, healing, mental health, advocacy. I can't access that the same way that someone else can. And so it's both being able to allow someone to say, I'm allowed to even recognize when I'm being in an unsafe or safe situation, because when I can recognize that, then I can actually do something about it. For so many individuals, they're like, what's the point of addressing what's unsafe and safe? What matters? This is my life. And there's no way that I'm ever going to get out of this because I've never seen it actually happen. I've never seen someone get out of the situation I'm in. And so we have to shift that so that individuals can make those identifications and access what they need. Hand it back to you, Haleigh.
So I think we've talked a lot about, we're kind of jumping the gun a little bit and getting into the community and societal level factors. But again, that's just to highlight how interconnected all of this is. So the community level risk factors are those things that are going to amplify the individual risk factors or maybe reflect the societal level risk factors, and also contribute to the individual risk factors existing in the first place. One thing I really want to highlight here that we've shared a little bit already is that trafficking happens by community in community. It's not like Taken. More often than not, survivors know who the trafficker is. They have some sort of relationship with them. The Polaris Project reported for 2020, 42% of victims were brought into trafficking by family. 42%. 39% were recruited by an intimate partner or through a marriage proposition. This looks a little different in labor trafficking. 69% were recruited by employers and just 15% were recruited by family members, but it still goes to highlight they know who the trafficker is. They know this person. They've established some relationship before that force, threat, coercion, whatever it is, has been used to get them into trafficking. And again, that's because we've got these social and economic inequalities inaccessible resources and or a lack of resources. So if I know this person has been providing for me and all of a sudden they ask me to do something, they say that I need to help them back, I need to give back to them for whatever all they've done for me already, I'm probably going to do that because we already have a relationship. Or I'm fearful that I will lose the thing that I need, right? I really want to highlight weak community sanctions. So this is the unwillingness of the community members to intervene when things seem off, or when there's an experience of violence, or they make excuses for people who harm others. So we've normalized violence and we say, well, you just need to get over it. You just need to let it go. That's just how it is, right? There's a lot of social isolation that's related to this as well. So maybe people in a neighborhood are disconnected, they don't know one another. Maybe going back to number 2, things are inaccessible. They don't have sidewalks in the neighborhood. So if I want to get out of my house or get out of my situation, it's not easy for me to access public transportation. So again, social and structural things kind of come in together there. Non-inclusive practices within organizations within the community. Again, this is going to be related to that social isolation piece as well, right? If I don't have access to meet people who would care about me, if I don't have access to see people like me in my community, or if I am pushed out of community spaces, then I'm going to go to the one person who's going to give me attention or who is going to meet my needs. All that said, we have protective factors. Yes.
Flip it. So what does it look like to address those things in our community? I think as Haleigh and I have kind of already touched on a bit, we're doing a lot of call to community in here because what we see as having a really big impact on changing some of these outcomes that we often see. And so that we can have different conversations every year instead of the same conversations that we have every year, is that we have to actually have some community response and community change. So what does it look like to do that? It's really flipping the other way, a lot of what Haleigh said so perfectly. So I'll just highlight this kind of briefly. But a coordination among community agencies, economic and housing assistance. I very rarely see success in being able to address an issue like human trafficking without having some type of coordinated response in doing so. So when you have youth who are coming into your agency or your school and they are needing food, you as youth care workers are like, okay, so we've been able to develop a number of partnerships in our community that I know that I can help this person access food. That may be the first step. We may not even know that there's anything else that that individual might be experiencing, human trafficking, any other type of violence, but we know they're hungry. So if we can find a resource to feed them, then maybe the next thing that we find out, or maybe the next thing this person says, I want to come to you for support on, is another experience that they're having, whether it's something like more within the criminal justice system. Maybe they're experiencing sexual interpersonal violence, maybe they're experiencing human trafficking. But all that to say, we have to be able to be have a coordinated response to this, and we have to think outside the box in terms of who needs to be in our toolbox, if you will, to support survivors. And so that's another reason why you hear Haleigh and I kind of talking about things like, we're not talking about human trafficking really anymore. We're talking about poverty. And if we're going to work with people who are experiencing poverty, what do we need? So that can be one way that we can flip the script. Another thing, as Haleigh kind of already addressed, is so many of those accessible spaces, both physically and socially. We touch a lot on accessibility. So you'll hear me say a lot that, especially when I'm working with agencies, I'll be like, so who's not coming in your door? And it's typically the people that we know who are experiencing some of the higher rates of violence, particularly around human trafficking. And I'm like, well, okay, so we need to talk about why you don't have Black survivors coming through your door. And we need to talk about why that may not be on them, but it could be on you as an agency. And it's a hard conversation, but it's a conversation we have to have if we're dedicated to this work. So what does it look like to increase accessibility, both physical space, have accountability to making sure that you are approachable and someone can actually physically and literally reach your door handle, but also how can they socially be a part of the community and the work that is being done and feel safe in that space. Multiple avenues for justice. I don't know if Haleigh or I touched on this in our intros, but we've spent a lot of time in terms of researching, being a part of, and supporting the development of different avenues of justice within different communities. And the reason that we do that is because we know that a lot of survivors who experience human trafficking don't feel like they can access the criminal justice system, and rightfully so for many of them. So the criminal justice system isn't always a response to a lot of survivors. And there can be other things that someone is experiencing in a community that doesn't need to involve the criminal justice system getting involved. So all that to be said, we look at ways like, how can we have forms of transformative justice for folks who are familiar that is really a community-based response to violence? And how can we support communities in developing that so that more people feel like they can come forward with whatever experience they're having and get the support that they need? Those positive and social connections and collective efficacy, again, kind of what Haleigh was saying in terms of feeling like communities are connected, feeling like you can have those positive connections within your community and in various different sections of your community. So not just maybe your street, or for me, like maybe not just the Black community. Like I need to know other folks in my community who don't look like me, because the reality is we all have a collective response to violence, but we also have a shared responsibility of each other. And then lastly, as I've already touched on, kind of that inclusivity around community spaces.
And of course, all of this leads to our societal level risk and protective factors. And we have touched on this a lot, so I'm going to try to be pretty brief so we can move forward. So social or societal level factors are those factors that create, influence, and perpetuate exploitation or oppression. So those are laws and policies that have intentionally discriminated, marginalized, and oppressed groups of people. Those are our cultural norms, the isms of the world, right? The racism, sexism, ableism, transphobia, all of those things that intentionally discriminate, marginalize, or oppress a group of people. When that is our framework for that some people are better than others and some people aren't as good, then we develop these cultural norms around violence, and it becomes acceptable to be mean to people. It becomes acceptable to be violent to people, or at least it's not as important when they experience those things. And so then we also see those weak social policies and weak sanctions around violence, particularly towards certain groups of people. If we don't have any kind of social protections, if our laws are intentionally discriminating against people, then probably those social policies and sanctions aren't very strong to protect them either. All of those things create those systemic inequities that we were talking about. So certain neighborhoods may have less transportation or less access to transportation. If anybody lives in the Marion County area, I know you know that there's some certain parts of town where there's a bus stop that's literally on a highway. On Keystone, I'm thinking of right now, there's a bus stop that is literally on the side of a highway. There's no sidewalk to get to it, right? So if there are, that's a structural inequality in play. It's harder for people to access their community. It's harder for people to get to where they need to go. It's harder for them to have connections. And then, of course, institutional and historical violence is really a huge risk factor here, and really important to think about in the context of violence and in the context of our laws and societal structure. So if we have all of this institutional and all of this historical violence, it's really, really hard to move forward in society and have an equitable society. We have to be really intentional and proactive to change those policies. We have some policies that are still in play, that are still discriminatory because we never changed them, right? Or we changed them just enough to seem a little less harmful, but they're realistically not, right? If we have this societal inequality today, we haven't really meaningfully changed those policies. All right. Morgan, tell us.
I love that, Haleigh, because I feel like Yeah, I feel like every once in a while I'll see things, I'm like, okay, I see what you were trying to do. But I still see that we didn't get there quite with the like changing of policies or laws and things like that. You're like, okay, well, we're just trying. But what are things we have to do to expand and actually make it accessible to folks? But so all that to say, flipping it and again, to the other side of the coin, having equitable social policies, obviously being able to um, have the support from a societal level that again is going to trickle all the way down to that individual protective factor, because the society and community, we have to wrap around individuals, we have to create it, and then that allows for the individuals to access it. So equitable social policies, we have to have norms that create belonging and acceptance. Um, and feel like I could talk about that all day, but just thinking about again, what are things both in my community, in my family, in my church, wherever it might be that you are within my organization, what are things that are putting up a barrier to someone saying, I belong here, I feel safe here, this is where I should be. And especially when we're talking about in our communities, that should be the feeling that every individual has. I feel safe here, I belong here, I'm loved here. I know someone put in the chat, like, thinking about youth who don't even realize what could be happening to them or the worst thing that could happen. But just knowing that at the end of the day, our community should be saying, but you're loved here. Accessible community spaces, making sure that we're addressing inaccessibility again and creating that accessibility so that folks actually can reach our door. Non-inclusive, safe business places and places of employment. So many reasons that we put this in here, but one thing that we often see when we talk about red flags, we would look at things there around labor trafficking that would be like not knowing your rights as a worker, which is important. Knowing your rights as a worker is important. Not having access to safety, not having being isolated. All of those things are important to know that someone could be experiencing. But what do we have to do to change that? We need to have inclusive and safe places to work. And so that's what we actually have to do as a society, is we have to change the ability for these outcomes to occur. And then, gosh, how are we preemptive and not reactive? And that's one of the reasons that we're even approaching you all today with a framework that is not necessarily a red flag framework, but there are layers to this. And again, we've been having a lot of the same conversations every year. We've been reacting to this issue the same way, and we're not seeing as much of a shift as we really want to see. And in the work, we're seeing a lot of wins, absolutely, big wins, little wins, whatever. We are winning in a lot of places, but also we're reacting. And so as a society, as folks who are here as youth care workers, but you're also a member of your community, whatever communities that might be, what are things that you can be doing in each of these areas to impact the actual outcome? So those are some of the societal protective factors. And I think I'm handing it back to Haleigh just to recap some of the key ideas before we move into our next section.
Yeah, I think we should skip forward a little bit so that we can move into our social identity exercise before we round it out with our policies. Y'all have heard us say the key ideas several times, so hopefully you can share with us what you think the key ideas are.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll move through this pretty quickly because we've talked about a lot of it, but wanted to provide you all a tool that I think is just really cool in terms of why does it matter to know who you are walking into a room and supporting the people that you're supporting, whether it's a youth who is maybe through an education role, whether you're working for a Department of Child Services, whatever role that you might be in. Why is it important to know who you are, what your relation to power is when you walk into a room to support another individual? And I actually like talking about this in terms of kids and youth, because kids and youth, you walk into a room and you're about to be read as a person, right? Like, I have never in my life met people who are going to be really honest about who I think you are, as a lot of kids and youth that we work with, which is great. Like, I love that. Thank you for figuring out who I am, because I need to also figure out who I am before I walk in this room and talk to you. And so it's important to think about how you relate and what your proximity to power is, because we're talking about individuals who have had so much power stripped away, for not just maybe who have experienced human trafficking. I'm talking kids who are just Black or queer, Indigenous, have accessibility needs, things like that. There's just been a lot of power that has been stripped. And so it's just important to look at this wheel and think about that. And I think it's an important tool, and it's colorful, and you can have conversations with kids about it too. So definitely use it. But just think about that relation to power. So we wanted to provide you 2 tools that are really kind of breaking down. Okay, so we talked about that relation to power. What does that actually look like? How can we have conversations both with the people that we serve, with the people in our community, with anyone that we are engaging in an intentional conversation with, about addressing any layer of work, but especially when we're talking about addressing violence, or we're just wanting to get to know the person in front of us. We wanted to give you all some tools that could help with that. And the last thing I'll just say about it is that I provided these tools for some faculty a couple weeks ago, in terms of getting to know your students who walk into a room, and them also being able to know who you are. And so we find it important, especially when we're talking about intentional relationship building. When we are working with youth who experienced human trafficking in particular, there's a lot of trust concern there on their behalf, which is so rightfully so. I don't trust you. I know who you are. Who are you? And reality is, like, even sometimes we think they don't care who I am. They don't want to know who I am. Yeah, they do. They 100% want to know who you are. So these 2 tools can be used, and you can sit down when you are doing an intake with someone, or you are getting them acclimated to your program, or whatever it might look like. And you can sit down and do these together. And so this is the personal identity wheel. What you typically do, and we're going to show you an example of our wheels here in a second. Which actually, yeah, that's a good transition. So what you do is that you can take a marker or a pen or whatever, and you want to mark where you feel you relate or identify the strongest. So for example, when it comes to something like, let's see here, I'm blind. Here we go. When it comes to something like political and social values, this is my actual personal identity wheel. I had a lot of fun doing it, because I went through like my own self whatever I was going through when I was doing it, and a lot of questions, and I felt pressure that I was supposed to mark where I felt the strongest, or I felt my identity was the closest to. I felt pressure in some places to put the marker somewhere, and then I had to talk to myself and say, no, Morgan, do this for you. And so, for example, like the political and social values, I marked that really close to me. And so you take the pen or you take your marker, and the closer the identity is to you, the closer you mark it on the personal identity wheel towards the center. And so for me, political and social values is really important. As a Black queer survivor, those identities have always been something that has both shaped me to be who I am, but also impacted how I engage the world and the world sees me. So when it comes to those values, it's important. And I look for those values in other individuals, because that tells me if I'm safe or not. Do you see me for who I am? So that was really important to me. And then you have something like sports teams, where I am a Saints fan through and through. I'm a Who Dat fan all day, but it's not critical to the everyday person that I am. Now, I do know people that lead their sports teams, which is totally fine. And that would be somewhere where you shift your identity marker. But it's important to do this. And we ask, like, what do you notice? Because thinking about the individuals who you might be working with and the different identities that they have, why might something like a sports team be less relevant than their social and political values, or less valuable than their critical life experience? Why do they hold such value to that? Why is that such a piece of their identity? And talk about it, and share those conversations. So Haleigh, if I can explain the social, and then I'll hand it to you to talk about your wheel. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Cool. So the social identity wheel, these are identities that have more or less been kind of placed upon you, in terms of these are where you fit in socially throughout the world. They may not be, again, necessarily something that it could be something that you identify really close with personally, or it could be something that society has said you have to identify, as. And so I actually like this one too, and it's interesting for me because where I place mine, but I will let Haleigh, you go ahead and explain. I don't want to steal your thunder.
Oh, you're fine. I'll be pretty brief. So when I was thinking about my social identities, I was also thinking about what's important to me and what's important for me to express to others. So you'll see I put physical appearance and body image pretty high. First of all, that's a social identity that we are told is important, right? We are told that the way we look in American society is really important. However, it's not out of vanity that I put that up close. It's because I can express who I am by the way I dress, by how brightly colored my hair is right now, by whether or not I wear makeup. I can say a lot about me and what's important to me by expressing that physically or through my clothes. So I chose that as a social identity that's both placed upon me, but also something that is important to me. Another one that I put in there is class and socioeconomic status. Again, that's something that's really important in American society, right? Like, you are judged by your socioeconomic background. You are judged by where you come from. However, this is also important to me. Again, sounds like an exercise in vanity, right? But I grew up without a lot of things, right? Like, I grew up fairly poor. My dad didn't graduate high school. Education wasn't something that was, it was important to me, and my dad wanted that for me, but that wasn't something that he had access to. And so now that I'm a grown up and I'm about to finish my MSW program, I've had all these opportunities for education and access to things. That's important to me, but my roots are important to me too. It's important to me to remember what it's like to be living in a trailer and worried about whether or not we're going to get evicted, and worried about, is college even a realistic expectation for me, right? That's important to me to remember that that's where I come from. Again, sexuality and sexual orientation, another thing that's really important societally and also important to me. I'm married to a man. I've been with my husband for 10 years, but I'm also a bisexual woman. And that's not immediately obvious to most people. And so it's something that I think is important and I want to share with people when I'm in conversation, because otherwise I'm read a different way. Morgan?
Yep, just to tie it all together, thank you, Haleigh, for explaining that. Just to tie it all together, the reason that, again, we find these tools can be really useful for you is because we're really wanting to instill that building of relationship can be important, but not just a come in my room, let me find out everything I need to know about you, but also just recognizing that individual you may be able to build a stronger relationship if you can be open about who you both are coming into the room together. And so breaking down that conversation and using those tools can be really helpful in doing that. We also just want to provide you some questions that you can take with you. You're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint, and as well as the identity wheels. But here are some questions if you do decide to maybe use these in the work that you're doing, that you can have with youth, and you can tailor them, or you can have with your staff, whoever you might want to have some of this intentional relationship building with. Here's some questions you can talk about to kind of guide those conversations. So hopefully it's helpful for you all. I enjoy doing it, and definitely want to encourage you all to do it too. And I'll briefly just talk about the can you leave, because this is a piece that comes up a lot when we have conversations with folks about human trafficking, and why can't you just leave? Or why can't they leave? And this, not saying anyone in this room has asked those questions, but I've worked with survivors who have said, Morgan, when you do trainings, can you address this, please? Because I'm tired of getting asked why I didn't just leave. So to stay true and to address that, I 100% keep doing it. So just wanted to break down, I won't go through these, just wanted to show, as we've been talking about all of these layers of societal, community, individual factors, protective and risk, all of those things kind of manifesting together, and thinking about the individuals that you're working with. There can be so many reasons that a person may not have the ability, and the ability being various different things, right? What ability is, but may not have the ability to leave the situations that they're in. And I think many of you have already addressed some of this in the chat, but we're talking about kids who many times may have come from situations that were not good. And a kid who looks at you and says, well, yeah, I'm experiencing X, Y, and Z. Often they will not say trafficking, but I'm experiencing X, Y, and Z, but it's better than where I came from. And that's a reality for a lot of the kids that we're working with. We may have kids who say, I have seen this, my mom did this, I saw my dad do this, et cetera, et cetera. I saw them try to get help. I saw them go to the police. Nothing happened. Why would I do all that? I saw what happened to them when they did that. And so we're talking about just so many layers that it's not just walking out of a door. If you don't have access to food, water, shelter, clothes, justice, healing, services, if you don't have access to those things, we cannot expect people to just walk out of the door, whether it's a kid or an adult. So anyway, that's just my little stage I like to be on for that. But I want to give it to Haleigh, because Haleigh's going to cover some really important things around organizational policies.
Yeah. So, and to kind of wrap all of that up and tie into our next section, we like to ask these questions. As you saw on the slide before, we want to know, it's important to know where we're coming from, and it's important to know where the youth we serve are coming from, because we can't meet them where they are unless we know where both of us are located, right? So that's part of why we do those identity exercises, and that's why we do so many self-reflections, right? So really think about what's important to you, spend some time reflecting on that, identify why that's important, and most importantly, I think in this conversation, identify how you would feel or what you would do if that was threatened or attacked. We've already discussed that survivors may have a relationship with their trafficker, and they may think that that person's really important, and they may have a lot of love and positive regard for that person. So think about what it would mean for you to be told that the thing that's most important in your life, or something that's really that you care about a lot, is harmful to you, and that you need to leave it. And so what all of that means is that you just have to talk about it. If you're going to meet those kids where they are, ask them what matters to them. Ask them how they know when something is important, and ask them how they protect what's important to them. If what they're identifying as important in that relationship or in that situation is loyalty and trustworthiness, then how can we reframe that in a healthier way? How can we protect loyalty and trustworthiness in relationships? And how can we establish that in a healthy way with someone who really supports us and takes care of us? Something that Morgan and I always really highlight to you right here is, what does justice look like to you? Survivors of violence are not often consulted about what justice means to them. And as we already discussed earlier, youth don't have a lot of rights. So when you're working with kids that are disclosing really heavy stuff to you, we know that we're mandatory reporters in the state of Indiana, right? We know that if there is a violent situation that a kid is involved in, we have to make a report. Do the kids you're working with know that? Have you told them from the outset that you're going to have to report some of the things that they say to you? They need to know so that they can make some informed choices for themselves about what they do and don't want to share about themselves with you. I'm just going to be honest. They need to have that option. And they also need to make informed choices about whether they want to hear that conversation. So that's a way, we're going to talk about trustworthiness. That's a way to establish transparency and trustworthiness. Hey, Morgan, you are this kiddo that I'm working with. I have told you repeatedly that if you share that someone is harming you, that I have to report that. You're starting to talk to me about something that sounds like it's going to be a possible report. So I'm going to tell you again to remind you. And then, do you want to be in the room when I make that call? Do you want me to put that on speaker so that you can hear exactly what I say, so that you know I'm not saying one thing to your face and doing something different when you're not in the room, right? Trust and rapport takes time and intentionality. We said it at the beginning. We got to move at the speed of trust, right? And that's the same with working with youth. We can't make any real progress unless we can develop some relationship with them first. We talked about violence and trafficking happening in community by community, right? That's in relationship. That's also where healing happens. So if we can reframe community and relationship for these kids, if we can show them healthy relationships and healing relationships, they can work towards that path to recovery, right? So we're going to talk about trauma-informed principles and trauma-informed care. And we're going to talk about that both in working with youth, but also within your organization, like I mentioned earlier. So I would love it if anybody, as I talk about trauma-informed care principles, I would love it if any of you could share some ways that your organization or your community has utilized these principles to take care of you. How are you seeing trauma-informed care in your workplace for yourself? So those 6 trauma-informed care principles, like I mentioned, trustworthiness and transparency, we've kind of talked about that a little bit. Peer support. So having other people that youth can connect with, that they can build relationships with, that have kind of been through some of the similar things that they've been through, that they have a shared experience, they no longer feel as isolated and alone in that. That's really important in healing. Cultural, historical, and gender lens when you're looking at the experiences that the youth in front of you have had, right? We have to know, again, where they're coming from, the societal context. We have to know the institutional context and the ways that they've been put in increased vulnerability because of those societal issues, right? We talked about that quite a bit earlier. Where I really want to highlight on these trauma-informed care principles is collaboration and mutuality and empowerment and choice. So empowerment and choice, we're recognizing that everyone's experience is unique. We're also recognizing that everyone deserves autonomy and the right to make choices in their lives. Now we're talking about kids. We just said we know that there are instances that we have to make certain reports because we're mandatory reporters. We also know that we have to do things that the kid may not like because we have to make sure that they're safe. But how can we build some choice into that? And how can we build some empowerment into that? So again, if I have to make a report, can I do that with you present? Do you want to listen to that report? Do you want to see what I write in that report? If I know that we have 2 options, can I present them to you instead of just making a choice for you, right? And building upon the skills of the kid in front of you. So if we know maybe in a therapeutic setting, this child is not interested in talking about their experience with you yet, maybe we can empower them to do something that is interesting to them. Okay, you don't want to talk in therapy? Cool. Do you want to go play basketball? I know you're really good at art. If it's really hard for you to talk to me about this, would you want to draw how that feels or draw what you're thinking about? Safety is going to be related to both physical environmental safety, but also psychological safety. How have we established a safe environment for someone to share with us what's going on in their lives? So that might even be down to the decor in the room. Are you trying to have a conversation about somebody's trauma with them in a small, cramped room with no windows, with concrete floors and beige walls? Do you think that's going to go well? Do you think that they're going to feel comfortable and supported in that environment? Probably not. So what are some ways that we can make the environment physically comfortable so that we can facilitate some emotional safety as well? And then, like I said, collaboration and mutuality, I really want to highlight here. If healing happens in relationship, then we know shared decision-making, shared power, things that are going to enhance that relationship are going to be really helpful in healing from that trauma. So are there some things that we can do together? Can we facilitate some peer groups where the kids can work together to do a project, make a meal, create their community and move towards that healing space? If those are our trauma-informed care principles for working with youth, like I just shared earlier, we also need to make sure that we are integrating that into our organizational policies and into our work with one another. If y'all are working with youth, you're already working in trauma. And I know you probably already know what secondary trauma looks like, feels like, all of it, right? If we were in person, I'd ask a show of hands of who has cried at the end of a work day working with kids, right? Like, I'm sorry, we've all been there at some point or another. So we know that that can really cause a lot of responses in us. How are we creating safety and cultures of belonging in our own organizations so that we're better prepared to go back out there and support the kids that need us? If we need all of these 6 principles to support and facilitate a healing relationship with the kid in front of us, why wouldn't we need that in our relationships with one another? Why wouldn't we need that in our organizations? So if I'm going to be the best advocate or case manager I can be, I need to know that I feel safe at work. I need to know that my voice matters, that I have choices, that I can band together with my colleagues to really shape our programs, to shape the organizational culture, to make choices about where we go from here. And I need to know that I can trust my immediate colleagues, my boss, my executive leader. We need that trustworthiness and that transparency at every level. So what can that look like in an organizational setting? Well, it can look like, hey guys, we're having a really rough year. Here's what's going on. I'm going to be honest with you. Here's how we can be really open and transparent about it. It also means that we are accountable and that we're following through on any decisions we make. So kind of an example to highlight this, trustworthiness, transparency, and accountability. In 2020, how many people's organizations decided they wanted to have some conversations about racial justice? How many people had a brand new DEIA committee started, right? Probably a lot of us in nonprofit work had this experience. How many have seen meaningful changes to your organizational policy as a result of that? And that's a real question. If y'all want to share, like, here's a really cool thing that my organization has done to be accountable and transparent and follow through, we want to hear that. But in conversations with so many nonprofit workers, we have learned that that's not always the case, right? So if we are initiating a new committee or we've got a new practice and we're saying we're committed to anti-oppressive practices, that means we have to have a tangible action that results from that. Just like Morgan said with kids earlier, they see right through us, right? They know when we're lying, they see who we are, they're going to be really honest with us, whether we want to hear it or not. And they know when we're bluffing. They know when we're not actually going to follow through on something. And if that's how we are treating each other in our organizations, are those kids going to feel like we are trustworthy ourselves? No, they are not. They're going to tell us we're full of it and they're not going to listen. They're not going to be interested in working with us, right? So it's really crucial that we establish that. I'm going to share with you the socio-ecological model again, just to say, oh, maybe, there it goes. Okay. We talked about how that intervention and prevention occur at multiple levels. This is also true in organizations, right? So trauma-informed practice and policy are relevant at all organizational levels. So at the individual, like we mentioned earlier, interactions with the clients, interagency collaborations, working together across the organization, in our community, and in our societal conditions too. So we have to be working towards creating social conditions that are trauma-informed, social conditions that do support the youth that we're working with. We want to influence those that create the need for us to be trauma-informed in the first place, right? So trauma-informed agencies recognize trauma happens at individual and organizational levels. Yes, an organization can be traumatized. We need to recognize historical and intergenerational trauma. We need to recognize that connection, community leads to healing. And we need safety and transparency for staff and programs to function optimally. So this organizational commitment to things like self-care means we're not just expecting staff to take care of themselves on their lunch breaks or on their own personal time. It means we're also creating time for self-care. It means we're working together to build community care. We're taking care of each other. That's what it means to be trauma-informed. So within your organization, some ways that you can influence the structure and culture and make some changes if you need to, or maybe you already have some amazing policies and connections in place, which again, we'd love to hear them. But policies really frame a lot of our organizational structure and culture, whether we want them to or not, right? Our documents tell a story of our organization, tell how we see our clients, tell how we see each other, and tell about how we see our communities. So with things like hiring practices, who are we excluding and how are we excluding them? Who are we including? How are we creating accessible job applications? How are we creating accommodations for those who need them? Where are we doing our recruiting? How are we targeting certain demographics? And one example I really like to use is in advocacy and case management. How often have we seen roles that say you need at least a bachelor's degree and 3 to 7 years of experience already serving this community, right? But what about lived experience? How often are we seeing lived experience positioned as equal to professional and academic experience? Who's going to know how to serve kids better than someone who had a similar experience, right? They can relate very easily. We can think about creative ways to serve. We can think about what did I need when I was that kid? So are there ways that you can kind of change those hiring practices to promote up people who have that lived experience and not just people who studied a lived experience in school, right? Your intake forms, things like that. How are you asking questions about demographics? How are you asking questions about experiences? And why are you asking the questions? Before you ever put something on an intake form, consider the impact that's going to have on your client and consider whether you actually need that information or not. So is this a reporting requirement? Is this a grant requirement? Is this an evaluation tool for us? Or am I actually going to use this information at all? If it's the last, you don't need to ask it. If you don't have a reason for asking it, don't ask it, right? Consider resourcing. Do we have the resources we need in our organization? Both human resources, but also supplies and funding. Are we expecting staff to carry caseloads well beyond the capacity that they have? Not even just capability, but their time capacity. How many of us have worked at organizations that had caseloads that we could not reasonably see in a week, in a month, what have you, right? Like, I've been there. If you're in a nonprofit, you've certainly had a caseload that was just too much, right? What does that say to our staff when we create these expectations of overwork? And what does that say to our clients? If I have a client that's in crisis and they're calling me and I can't get them in for 2 to 3 weeks, that's not telling them that I prioritize them. That's not telling them that their crisis is important to me. So how can we shift some of those caseloads to be a little more equitable and get the resources we need to fully and completely serve people? Are we living in a scarcity mindset? That's another piece of this resourcing. Are we telling the story to ourselves, to our community, to our clients that we don't have everything we need and that we are always at the precipice of crisis? If that is the case, that is A, not trauma informed, and B, we are not doing good enough planning to have what we need to support and to provide those services. Our community connections are a big piece of our organizational structure and culture as well. Who we partner with, how we partner with them, and why we partner with them are really, really critical. If we know there's a community stakeholder who is blatantly racist, sexist, homophobic, and we still show up to community meetings with them and we still invite them into our spaces, what are we telling both our clients, our staff, and the rest of our community about how we see that person or that organization? We're validating that, right? So we need to be really critical about assessing community stakeholders, assessing our partnerships, and really vetting those resources and determining if that's going to be a good fit for us in our program, if that's going to serve our clients and staff well to have that relationship. Education is going to be very related back to that resourcing question as well. Do we have the resources for staff development? Are staff being given opportunities for education and learning? If you're here today, you are. So thank you for being here. Do staff have confidence in company protocols? Do they feel prepared and adequately trained and oriented in their position? Or are they given like a one-day rundown of the organization and then sent off on their merry way to figure it out, right? Like, do you have everything you need to do your job effectively? The staff interactions, we've talked about this quite a bit, but how are we facilitating that peer support? How are we facilitating a space of mutuality and collaboration? Are we pitting staff against one another? Are we ensuring certain programs don't interact at all? Again, not trauma-informed and not providing a culture that's really effective in addressing the needs of our clients. We need to make sure that we're ready for program growth before we actually engage in that program growth. So thinking about that strategic planning, thinking about getting the resources, how we're going to get the resources before we just add another service onto our advocates or case managers or support specialist caseloads, right? So when you're evaluating your policies, when you're doing an assessment of your organization, really take some time to think to yourself, is this ethical? Is this equitable? Who's impacted by the choices our organization makes? Who's impacted by the policy changes we implement? How will they be affected? And how could this change or this policy create ripple effects that we haven't even considered yet? So an equitable policy development, really kind of applying those trauma-informed care principles and thinking about the implementation of trauma-informed care in your organization will help you create equitable policies that foster that sense of support and community engagement within your organization. So kind of 5 things to think about when you are developing policies for your organization. The first one, governance and leadership. That means we have a top-down commitment to ensuring equity and to trauma-informed care. Top-down commitment to make sure that this is going to be implemented at all levels of the organization, internal, external, with clients, with community, with one another. There's an identified action plan with steps and identified points of responsibility. And we have at least more than one person championing change, right? We can't just have one champion of everything all the time because that person is going to be burnt out. How can we work together to implement equity and trauma-informed care within our organization? If we're developing a committee, what are the next steps? And who's responsible for making sure those steps happen? So that moves into our trust and accountability. Building trust requires accountability, requires transparency. It requires that we follow through on all of our promises. And if we can't make it happen, we never promise it, right? Just as if we're working with our clients. We don't promise what we can't follow through on, right? So what are our action steps for accountability? If I'm a leader in an organization and I make a mistake, because I'm gonna, because people make mistakes, right? How am I accountable for that mistake? How can my staff call me in? And what action steps do I need to take to repair that harm? That's how we establish that trust and accountability. Our environment and our community. So how are we creating equity in the environment and in our organizational community? Do we have a ramp to get into our organization for wheelchair users? Are our doors wide enough for somebody's wheelchair to come through? Thinking about universal design, making our space accessible for everyone makes it accessible for anyone, right? Like if I have an accommodation and I ask for that change, if you just have that change implemented for everyone, then no one has to ask for that particular accommodation in the future. It's just already there. That means people with my particular need or people with disabilities are going to feel that they are welcome and safe in that space. How are we engaging with the community? Is there a cultural diversity and diversity of the community reflected in your staff? Do your staff look like and represent the community that you serve? If not, think about why that is. Reflect back on those hiring policies, reflect back on what you can be doing for recruitment and how you can change some of those job descriptions maybe to recognize lived experience or to support community coming into your organization as well. So lastly, I really want to focus on, again, collaboration and mutuality, inclusion of staff and peer voices. Do we feel that we are all part of this organization? Do we all feel like we have a stake in what's happening around us? Do I feel that my expertise and knowledge is respected by my organization? If I'm hired to do a job, do I have the space I need to do it? And do I have the resources I need to do so? Can I ask for those resources? We are listening to one another and we are working together. Again, we need those other pieces of accountability and transparency in order to create those working relationships. An investment in all of the above, right? We need to invest in all of these tactics. We need to invest in all of these strategies. And we also need to invest in the resources needed to make these things happen. So I'm going to tell you right now, if your organization, if your building isn't accessible, it's going to cost money to make it accessible. That's just a reality. It's not cheap, but it is always worth it to make it more accessible to the folks who wouldn't have access otherwise, right? That is how we really meaningfully change those social conditions. We're investing in evaluation as well. We need to spend some serious time assessing our organizations, assessing our policies, assessing the efficacy and effectiveness of our programs, right? But that also means we're assessing how we interact with one another and evaluating ourselves. So some self-reflection, some evaluation of our policies and organization, and really if we don't have those skill sets in our organization, how can we find someone who can help us do that? Spending time to truly meaningfully focus on that evaluation to make those changes. Again, that professional development piece is going to cost money, right? If we're going to provide education and resources to folks, it's going to require an investment. If we are investing in the wellness of our staff so that they do feel safe and supported, and we are building those cultures of care, that means we're investing in resources such as paid time off. We're offering paid time off. We have wellness packages that are comprehensive to the needs of our staff. We have EAP options. We have healthcare options that are going to provide what folks need to get their healthcare needs met. And lastly, I really want to think, when you're thinking about investment, think about, this kind of goes back to those community connections as well. Is our fundraising compromising our values? This is a big one to evaluate, a big one to think about. Who we take money from and what they want from us can compromise our values, right? It can compromise how the community sees us. So really think through, is this funder somebody we want to be associated with? Is this program or this grant going to support our program? Is this grant going to have strings attached that are going to compromise our mission and values? If that's the case, then we don't take that funding. We find it elsewhere. And so it takes some really intensive and intentional time to think through how those things all kind of impact and trickle down to the interactions we have with clients in our community, but they do, right? It sends a message about what we value and who's important to us. Okay, I'm gonna let Morgan real quick go through our resources so that we can give Bailey some time to end, but
Awesome.
thank you all so much.
Awesome. No, thank you, Haleigh. I appreciate all that insight and going there, especially when we're talking about funding, because I was just sitting here like, oh man, whew, that's a call in we all need. So in terms of reporting, I just want to give a quick caveat and just say that Haleigh and I really thought intentionally about our approach today. And again, like this may have looked different than human trafficking training that you've received before. Not, spending a whole lot of time on like red flags and looking at different survivor stories and just things like that. And to be really transparent, a lot of that is because, we're both from rural communities in Indiana. We know that there are people being left out of this conversation because we have become so tunnel visioned on who's being trafficked, what it looks like, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is that a lot of the youth that you're working with, it's not going to present as human trafficking. It's going to present as I'm hungry, poverty. It's going to present as maybe lack of support in the home. It's going to present as generational trauma. It's not going to present as, oh, I'm experiencing human trafficking. And I just want to say that because as we get into this reporting piece, being cognizant of all the things that we've talked about in terms of what are some of the things that you are bringing into a room as your implicit bias, as your what you have come to understand as, if I see this, this, and this is human trafficking. What are you bringing into the room versus how is that impacting how you're reaching that individual and ultimately what you're doing to support that person? So just want to say that because again, this has looked a little different today in our conversation, but that was really intentional to kind of broaden the scope of what we're talking about when we're talking about human trafficking. So in terms of reporting, wanted to provide you the hotline number if you suspect anyone under the age of 18 is experiencing human trafficking. As we said earlier, there's a CHINS designation. You call, the request is that you specifically say you suspect human trafficking because it does elicit a specific response from the department. So that is that number if you need it, which I'm sure probably all of you have already. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, great resource, pulls a lot of data that really informs our work and in the field, but it's 24/7, has over 200 languages available, and you can text. And you don't have to be someone reporting to call in. You can be a survivor who is just needing resources. So definitely a great resource for folks. And if you're working with someone and want to say, hey, here's a good resource for you too, you can pass it along. And then lastly, just to kind of round it all out, we do have some statewide resources that we wanted to share with you all. You'll see a number of them in here. You may be really familiar with them, but we wanted to be holistic and what types of resources you might need. So from legal to disability justice to how do we talk about alternative forms of justice like transformative justice, for example. How do we increase language access? So thinking through all of those pieces that especially Haleigh shared in terms of how do we build a trauma-informed organization, wanted to give you some of the resources that you could do that throughout the state and then also nationally. So check out and if folks have more questions and want to dive deeper into some of these resources, or even are like, hey, I'd love to maybe be connected. Haleigh and I are connected to a lot of these folks. So please feel free to reach out to us and we can have conversations and connect you to whoever you might need. And then lastly, wanted to hand it over to Bailey to finish us out. And if folks have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. If not, we'll follow up with you individually and get back to your questions. But thank you all for being here. Bailey, I'll hand it to you.
All right, let me just pull up my screen here. So thank you so much to Haleigh and Morgan, and thank you to everyone for attending. There will be an evaluation link sent to you later this afternoon. If you'd like to fill out a survey, you can also scan the QR code here and fill it out right now. If you enjoyed today's presentation and would like to continue your learning, I would invite you to consider visiting our HCET Virtual Learning at learn.hcet.org. There are new learning opportunities being updated regularly. And with that, I would again like to thank everybody for being here. Thank you to our presenters. We are going to conclude our webinar for today. Thanks for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks everyone for being here. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, y'all.
Rosalie, I don't know if you're still on here. Yes, Haleigh and I feel like we both have done youth presentations before. If not, we know a lot of folks who can do some of that direct youth work. So for sure, if you're interested, I guess we didn't really drop our contact in the chat. If you're interested, Rosalie, please reach out and we can connect you or talk about that more. So thanks for that question.
Morgan, I can't ever remember your email address if you want to toss it in there. It's so long.
I can also, if you guys are comfortable, I can also add it in our follow-up email.
Perfect.
I can add your contact info.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely dropped the ball on that. And I just use my work one because it's shorter. So I don't even want to type it out, Haleigh.
That's fair.
Awesome. I just put them in the waiting room so they can still grab things from chat if they need to. But other than that, you guys did a great job. Nice job. I will be sending you both an email probably tomorrow with just some final paperwork for you to fill out. And then we'll collect surveys for the next 2 weeks. And then once we close those, I will send you the results and everything everybody has to say.
Awesome.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Haleigh. This is great. Really appreciated it.
Awesome. Well, you guys have a great rest of your afternoon, and I'll talk to you later.
You too.
Bye.
Talk to you.
Bye.